Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I apologize to all of those who have to look at me again. After all, I look the same. This is what Professor Tangermann told me yesterday after I have seen him, maybe after 10 years, I don't know. Maybe it's another way of saying you don't look that young anymore. But my topic, and I hope at least I have to offer a little bit, not just more of the same, but maybe a different topic, but slightly, of course, related to what was there this morning. So it's on poverty and nutrition, and it's a paper together with Lena Hofeld, and this has been part of the ADB's Key Indicator project in 2014, which is now a chapter of a book that's coming out this time. And it's basically using the same data set as I mentioned this morning. I'm going to explain that again. So I have a few remarks on the background. I want to then phrase 4 research questions that are connected to this paper, quickly talk about the database, then there's an empirical model, and then I show the results. So basically I have a lot of descriptive results, so I apologize if there are tables that probably cannot be seen very well. And then I just pick out an excerpt of the model results and sum up. Okay, so I think what's the story and what's the background? I think we all know that poverty is a multi-dimensional issue, and that nutrition, undernutrition, malnutrition is one of that dimension of poverty, and that we also could perhaps say that the correlation between monetary and non-monetary poverty, among which undernutrition is one of the non-monetary indicators, that correlation is not always high. And it doesn't mean if you have overcome monetary poverty or reduced monetary poverty, you also have been equally successful in malnutrition. And I think Chi-Kun's data about China also have emphasized that, as have many others. Nutrition then perhaps can be called as one of the untold side of the poverty reduction story. As we have seen, and this has been brought out several times very clearly and impressively in this conference, what can happen if there are suddenly some shock events like the food price crisis 2007-2008. Now, in this paper we look at the question, what do we know about malnutrition in emerging market economies such as Thailand and Vietnam? This is particularly to the rural population. And what sort of can we assume or say about the implications for health and labor productivity, although I'm not going to deal with that in this paper. Okay, so I have 4 research questions. The first one simply is phrased as, is there still a nutrition problem in Thailand and Vietnam in spite of the progress made in poverty reduction? The second one is, what are the factors that condition the nutritional status, particularly of children? Of course, when we talk about undernutrition, we mainly talk about children in the rural areas of these 2 countries. Third, what are the factors that influence the nutrition outcomes? So these are the classic indicators: weight for age, height for age, body mass index, and so forth. As these households depart from the monetary poverty line. In other words, as they move up the income line, what happens to malnutrition? What happens to these nutrition outcomes? That is basically the question. And then sort of lastly, and that's kind of a speculation thing where we say, what is the time horizon to reach end of malnutrition given we have different income growth scenarios? So there is this paradigm, or I don't know how we can call it, that by 2030 basically poverty has disappeared from Asia, and that's what some of the ADB predictions would say, given things would go the way they have gone in the past. So what would happen to malnutrition under such a scenario? Okay, as I said, the data is the same as I had for those of you who had been in the session in the cellar this morning. There is this panel data set from the 6 provinces in Vietnam and Thailand. which started out with 4,400 households. We are now down to about 4,000 households due to attrition. And there are 4 panel waves, and we have the first one in 2007, the second in 2008. We didn't have one in 2009, but we have one in 2010, so we could still say, okay, that was before the crisis and after the crisis. It's basically, we have in the data set, we have a lot of household characteristics, so including information on weight and height of adults and children, so of all the household members, and of course a very detailed consumption module that allows us to calculate consumption and therefore look at poverty rates in these areas, and a number of other indicators and variables that would be in principle useful to try to explain the nutrition outcomes. Okay, so the way we have approached this is then to say, okay, let's compare the nutrition outcomes among 4 types or groups of households. The first one, let's take those, the poor, and those where we observe in the household at least one child with undernutrition. So those below the poverty line and with undernutrition. And then let's compare that to another group that is also poor, but where we do not observe children with undernutrition. And then the third, that's just following logically, non-poor and undernutrition, and finally non-poor and no undernutrition. So sort of trying to dissect this problem by saying, okay, can we see differences in these groups? That was the first approach, and a rather descriptive approach in the first step. Okay, so we have the descriptives, and then later I come to a nutrition model, which I don't go too much into detail again. So I think starting out with some of the empirical results, and this is what Dr. Darani also mentioned, what we find also in the rural households is that at the same time we have households where you have overweight, so obesity, and you have underweight. So in the same household you have this kind of observation for whatever the reasons may be. And you could see that, that this is Vietnam. Okay, this would be underweight, this would be normal weight, and there is a little bit of obesity. So the blue part would be those that have both. Basically, we call them the double burden household in nutrition transformations. And we could see that this is a bit higher in Thailand, and that it's actually also a bit increasing over the 3 waves that we have in. So we have 2007, 8, and 10. Yet also we still have quite a bit of underweight among children, and which is, of course, in Thailand, as we would expect, lower than in Vietnam. So that's, okay, that's the starting point of the story. There is something going on in these households that when it comes to nutrition. Now, okay, I don't know, this can be seen very clearly, but here we try to simply move up the income line. Okay, group 0 to $2 PPP per capita, and they 2 to 3, 3 to 5, and sort of make different intervals. And then see what's going to happen to several of these nutrition outcome indicators. Okay, weight for age. Okay, we have this set scores where you measure this weight for age against the standard population, and you see how much you deviate from that. And of course, there is a threshold, -2 standard deviations, and then you say, okay, that's under nutrition or underweight. And then, okay, as you move up this income line, you see a little bit, although it's not so clear what's happening sort of in the lower part. Okay, if we say $4 kind of would be the threshold for middle income. This morning we have heard Africa, they say 2. I think Asia, they say 4. ADB uses 4 as a threshold. And then as you go up, and this is kind of, we have a few households which would have $10 per capita a day in that data set, in that rural data set. And you could say, okay, there is something going on, but it's not so clear because there is a lot of variation, and obviously there are other reasons, which is not only related to income. And that's pretty much the same in Vietnam, although, of course, the overall level is higher. And maybe it's a bit clearer in Vietnam than it is in Thailand. Overall, what we found, the data for Vietnam came out better than the Thai data for some reason. Okay, that's the first part. Then we look at the distribution. So this is basically what I said. Okay, you calculate these set scores for weight for age, and then you have this. This is Thailand, and then here this would be sort of the threshold for undernutrition. And then the same for Vietnam, where it's, of course, the share of those which are below that threshold would be higher. That's what we would expect. Just for illustration, what we have done. And that, of course, we have for all the other indicators. Now, this is the same graph I had this morning. So this looks at the food share in total consumption, again, before the crisis and after the crisis. So again, we saw in Thailand that well, maybe the mode was in the order of 50% of the total consumption expenditures was for food, and after the food price crisis, this was where food prices were still higher, although they had come down a bit, but the reporting period is basically 2009, May to April 2010. So basically what we capture is most of 2009 in this. So here it has probably 70% or something would be the mode. And that's quite different, or quite more remarkable, or quite more pronounced if you compare this distribution from Vietnam before and after. So, okay, until now we could say, yes, there is a food issue in these rural households, which not all of them are poor. Some are, we had a lot of this discussion, okay, all farmers are poor. No, of course not all farmers are poor in terms of that. And there are some which have moved quite far away from the poverty line in similar conditions. This is all northeast Thailand, and this is all central highlands of Vietnam. So the conditions are pretty much similar. Okay, now looking at the four groups, and this is simply looking at some income parameters and income composition of this group. So we have the poor and underweight. Okay, this is in PPP dollar per month, per capita and month. So this would be below the poverty line if you calculate it in a day. And then you look at the share of agricultural income. Of course, the share of agricultural income, interestingly also, it's not dominant, so it's even below 50%, and here it's around 50%, and it's much lower as you move up, as you move away from poverty. So agriculture, and these are all rural households, basically, you could say. Agricultural households with a lot of farm and self-employment income sources. Okay, then we look at other income sources like share of natural resources, going out, catch a fish, collecting mushrooms, logging and stuff like that. Okay, that's also seems to be clear. It's higher for the poor, but not so much difference between whether underweight or no underweight. So there's not so much you could discover immediately from just looking at the data. Then have some other parameters like food consumption per capita a month. Okay, we already had that. And the share of households with small-scale business. Yes, of course, that's a lot higher in those as you move away from the poverty line. There will be more households which have some small-scale business. So that could all be, in principle, factors that could help to explain why you have differences. Okay, this is for Vietnam, so this was for Thailand. Basically having similar, maybe don't have to explain that again. Now, look at the comparison of household characteristics. That's the other set of variables between these four groups, and here taking again Thailand. If we take household size, households have become smaller, definitely. There are not as many people anymore. And we have, and then I have to explain that, I have to mention that we adopted a flexible, open household definition. That means we included migrants into the household. That's the World Bank, for example, when they do a household survey, they would say if somebody is away for 180 days, he's not counted in that household anymore because he doesn't share most of the time the food table. Now, for a number of reasons, we have adopted an open definition to that because of that connection between migrants and the rural households. So, okay, this would show household size, dependency ratio, whether or the number of migrant months that these households have. So we calculated that in migrant months per year, the share of agricultural workers, the share of wage workers. Again, you see differences here between poor and non-poor, and then a number of other infrastructure indicators that sometimes relate to the situation in the village as a whole, and sometimes it was collected from the individual households. And we have the same thing for Vietnam on this one. So, okay, households, pretty much the household size is quite comparable. You have another important feature in Vietnam is the ethnic minority share. So that's something that comes into the picture, which does not exist in the Thai data set. There are a few Khmer and Lao people, but that's not really sort of ethnicity, in terms of ethnicity, a big difference. They have been there for a long time. Okay, again, share of agriculture worker. Vietnam is, as expected, higher. And again, you see the differences between poor and non-poor. You don't see so much differences between the underweight. You could guess sometimes, you could see something, okay, here in the underweight there is a higher share, and here the share is also higher when you compare within the same group. Okay, so there are a number of indicators where we could perhaps discover some differences between the four groups. Now, one important thing is to look at the child and the mother characteristics. I mean, we all know from the nutrition modeling that it's not enough to just link a child's nutritional status to what food it gets. It has been, to some extent, conditioned by the mother's health condition. And so, okay, what we have here is data on the mother's height and the education of the mother, and whether the mother is a migrant or not. So the share of mother migrants in the household, as we had expected, would make a difference. And of course, okay, you could perhaps say there is a bit of a difference. Now height, that doesn't say too much, but okay, you deal of course with a different dimension if you compare it to Europe, but there are differences. Then what is the child's condition? Was in the reporting period, was the child sick? And gender would be another one, okay, assuming that maybe there is a difference in nutrition between male and female. Okay, that's for Thailand, and the same again we would have for Vietnam. And then also in tendency you could see similar differences. Okay, education seems to maybe play a role when you compare underweight in the same group. Here again, and then the migration. Migration overall is a lot lower in the Vietnam households as compared to the Thai households. Thai households, basically, almost everybody has a migrant, at least for some months of the year. Okay, now after this descriptives, move on to the nutrition model, which is a kind of standard nutrition model where we have in the database the nutrition outcomes. Nutrition outcomes, we would have these different nutrition indicators, so weight for age, height for age, weight for height, which you can relate by simply having these two information, and then the body mass index, what is that? The weight to the height square or something like that. Anyway, what is important for the children is these three. The body mass index doesn't play such an important role for the children. So then you would say, okay, the nutrition outcome of an individual at any point in time of this any of these 3 years In a household, so a child in a household is related to the income of that household, to different characteristics of the child, of the mother, and of course if we take adult as a nutrition outcome, then we would take the adult characteristics. It would be related to a set of village characteristics, a set of household characteristics. So is this an agricultural household? It has the kind of things that I showed before. Does it have maybe a small-scale business? Is it good access to natural resources, and so forth? And then a set of village characteristics which describes the infrastructure condition of the village. Okay, now here I just show you one, and then that's really difficult to see, and I show you the Vietnam result. That came out a little bit better than the Thailand result, and we pooled also data. So we run, of course, a number of models on this and different specifications, but this one is using the Vietnam data set, and then you could see, okay, if you pool them all together, then you find something for income. If you split it up into the 4 groups, then the income coefficient is no longer significant. That's maybe explained to the fact that you then have very small groups and small numbers in the groups, and then, but overall you could say, okay, maybe there is an effect of income. And then you find a number of the variables that you would expect, okay, the health condition, that you would find the education, but not throughout. So it's not very good in terms of, what you would expect as a good econometric results. But you get something, okay? You can say, yes, some of the variables, some of the hypotheses that we put in, you can see something. There seems to be a bit of difference. Okay, so these models we did for Thailand, for Vietnam, and we had different variants of the model, and sort of, I would say it's maybe not perfect, but there is something that could be shown. Okay, then we used this rather imperfect model results and said, okay, let's speculate. Yeah, ADB wanted that in any case. They wanted their 2030 target, and then we said, okay, let's work with different income growth scenarios, 2, 4, 6, 8% per year. What would that do to the different nutrition outcome indicators for Thailand and for Vietnam? Okay, we just do weight for age and height for age. Height for age, I didn't mention the data before, where much the below standard is much higher than the weight for age. And then you would say, okay, it would certainly go down by 2030, but it would not disappear. And for Vietnam, it would still be sort of, if you take maybe the 4% is something that we could probably say is quite reasonable, then you come up with a percentage of 18%, which is, by the way, something that Hodinot and colleagues, they predicted that in a study they did 15 years ago. So we come to a quite similar conclusion when we use that model and that data set. Okay, so what does this tell us? Perhaps if we sum that up, I think what we could say with quite some confidence that the nutritional problems continue to exist in both countries despite of this success in poverty reduction. And they exist across all the income groups, so they are not disappearing completely with reduced poverty. In Thailand, okay, 13, and in Vietnam, 25% of the adult population are below body mass index of 18.5, which is basically the measure for undernutrition. There is a substantial proportion also above, so that means obesity. For height for age and weight for age, the shares below the critical levels. So for height for age, they are much higher, 49 and 16% in Thailand, and 60 and 27% in Vietnam. Some evidence that poverty line is not a strong indicator for the disappearance of nutrition problems. I think that's probably not something new, but at least you can say that's what we find. So maybe it's not completely wrong what we observe over time. The share of individuals who fall within the norm values of nutrition outcomes only gradually decline with higher income. So it goes a lot slower than what happens sort of in poverty reduction. The last 2 points would be, okay, if we look at the causal factors, we would say health, gender, and mothers, anthropometric conditions, of which we have only 2, of course, and some village characteristics are factors that were significant in several of the model variants, which I didn't show all of them. And then if we accept this sort of heroic prediction, then we would say the models, they tend to support the notion that reducing or eliminating monetary poverty, which some people expect to happen by 2030 in Asia, that this would not eliminate nutrition problems or nutrition poverty as such. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and this is me when I retire, and I hope I look the same. Thank you very much.